we'll wait for everyone, see if anyone else shows up. I know you see the Glassfords maybe here and some others. So we'll give it another minute or two. But why don't we just take a couple minutes to check in and just, very generally talk about how we're doing, what's been good lately, what's been hard.
Well, my fishing buddy came down with COVID yesterday.
Oh, I did. I'm sorry.
Yeah, of course, I haven't fished with him since last March. So
right. Yeah.
He's 76, I guess, and got diabetes.
Mercy.
He's
fishing.
a little concerned.
Sure. Yep. I understand that. That's
one of David's cousins died Monday.
Yeah, but we're not going to try to go to the funeral. It's up in Boone.
Oh, sure. Mm-hmm.
Funeral's Friday.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, David.
Well, it seems like it's just everybody's getting that age. They're just passing away.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There's a quote I'm thinking of, and I can't remember if it's from a movie or a book, but it said, it seems we've reached that point in life where life starts, instead of giving us things, starts taking them away. But that's kind of it's a rather pessimistic view of life, I think. It certainly can feel that way, but I know at the same time that, we're grateful for the time that we have. And that every day is a gift. I try to talk about that in my newsletter article, the last one I put out, about time and how we think about time. And oftentimes we think about time as never having enough of it. And, I think it's easy to feel that way. I remember when my mom died, suddenly it was just like, I felt robbed, in many ways, and
So young.
right. And I still do. And it's not like an anger or a resentment or something I feel towards God, but it's just it's just at the just randomness of it, and the situation itself. It's just hard, and I think a lot of us feel that way when we have family members, or especially when we can take stock of it and it seems like we've lost a lot. And I think it can blind us to while I think it's good to grieve, and it's good to feel those feelings of grief and loss, it's also something it's also another thing entirely that goes along with it, to still look around and take stock of what's good and what we do have, and how those things continue to give us life and help us to see life as worth living to the fullest, with what time we have. But I won't drone on. I'm sure the people that may watch this later don't want to hear me talk about time and life and death. Maybe they do. Oh man, it's really good to be with all of you today. I loved last week, and I'm excited for what today might bring. So let's take a moment to pray, and then we'll jump right in. Gracious God, we thank you for in this space you've gathered us with open hearts and minds to receive your word for us today. We pray that as we examine the contours of your word, that you would speak to us, that your spirit would be faithful to transform us in our learning, and that we would find in listening to each other a deeper grasp of your mysteries and who you are and who you reveal yourself to be through the scriptures. I pray for each one of those who have gathered in this space, and for those who might watch this and participate with us at a later time. May your spirit rest on them, give them peace, so that they may be fully present in this moment with this time we have to share. We ask these things in Christ's name. Amen.
Amen.
All right. So last week, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So I find it helpful to look at, to look together at the scriptures, and if y'all are still good with that, and the look at the scriptures together.
Wow, that's
and then,
pretty.
And some artwork as well.
I like that.
Yeah,
I like that picture.
So I get this to move. I hate Zoom sometimes. It's so hard to mess with. Hang on a second. Let me do this.
I guess you could just enlarge it. I know it had.
Well, I hit enlarge instead of play. I just meant to hit play on the slideshow. Oh man, people are gonna just be ragging on me because I'm supposed to be a young person who knows technology well. Okay, here we go. We're all together here. Yeah. So last week, this is where we left off. We talked about issues of fasting and what it means to pour new wine into old wineskins and the foolishness of that, and patching a garment, an old garment with a new patch of cloth, and how that tears away, and how what Jesus was bringing into the world was radically new and fully of God, and yet the ways in which we as humanity, and particularly the Jewish community, had been perceiving and walking with God, perhaps may have become over time, as has happened in the church as well, something that is tired and perhaps a little too religious and legalistic, and how sometimes God takes a turn and wants to pull us towards something new, and yet we keep going in the old comfortable ways. And so that's where we left off last week. Jesus telling this parable or these stories to the Pharisees and the rulers. So we're going to be moving into chapter 6 today, and so chapter 6 contains a number of stories here. 2 stories that start out with Jesus talking about the Sabbath. Things that happen on the Sabbath for which he is criticized. And so we're going to look at that real quick. And let's see. And so we'll read this together, and we'll look at the art as well. Yeah. Would someone want to read this? And if you'd rather read your own translation rather than what's on the screen, that's A-okay with me.
I can read it.
Great, David. Thank you.
One Sabbath, as Jesus was going through the wheat fields, his disciples were picking the heads of wheat, rubbing them in their hands and eating them. Some Pharisees said, "Why are you breaking the Sabbath law?" Jesus replied, "Haven't you read what David and his companions did when they were hungry? He broke the law by going into God's house and eating the bread of the presence, which only the priest can eat. He also gave some of the bread to his companions. Then he said to them, 'The Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath.'" On another Sabbath, Jesus entered a synagogue to teach. A man was there whose right hand was withered. The legal experts and the Pharisees were watching him closely to see if he would heal on the Sabbath. They were looking for a reason to bring charges against him. Jesus knew their thoughts, so he said to the man with the withered hand, "Get up and stand in front of everyone." He got up and stood there. Jesus said to the legal experts and Pharisees, "Here's a question for you. Is it legal on the Sabbath to do good or do evil, to save life or to destroy it?" Looking around at them all, he said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." So he did, and his hand was made healthy. They were furious and began talking with each other about what to do to Jesus.
Perfect. Thank you, David. So in your hearing of that, what are some of your initial reactions to these confrontations between Jesus again and the Pharisees that were hanging out? And these are 2 different Sabbaths, by the way. Don't know how far removed they are from each other, but so the first Sabbath and then another Sabbath later on. So what are you seeing here?
I think Jesus was very brave
Yeah.
because, he could have avoided these things, but he was making a point that he was Lord.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, the Pharisees were probably jealous of his power and of the way that he was sort of turning the people towards the word, while the Pharisees and legal experts wanted them to be in the rut that they were in and subject to them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, Jesus seems to be perhaps differentiating between the letter of the law, so to speak, and the spirit of the law.
Mm.
If that makes sense.
Yeah.
It's like over time, in any religion, I mean, this is not just true of the Judaism of Jesus's time, but also the Christianity of our time, is how something that at one time was a central, very important way of understanding something in the faith. Say, for instance, we'll talk about the Eucharist or Holy Communion, and how over time that becomes something that it's not supposed to be, if that's what makes sense. So like in 1 Corinthians, for instance, in that community, Paul makes a big deal about it in 1 Corinthians 11, about the practice of Holy Communion and how that was taking shape in the life of the people in Corinth. And it was such a big issue that Paul had to use a huge chunk of that letter to say, look, the way you guys are practicing this is not the way it was handed down to you. You've lost the spirit of what this is about. So he says, I received a tradition from the Lord that on the night in which he gave himself up for us. I mean, this is literally where we get our liturgy from around Holy Communion, is from these words of Paul in 1 Corinthians 11. And he says, I've heard stories about how you, who are wealthy and well off, you're coming in there, you're getting drunk on the communion wine, you're partaking of the bread in such a way that when laborers come in from their jobs and are wanting to participate in worship and partake from the sacrament, there ain't nothing left. And you have completely lost the spirit of what this is about. And woe be unto you who take communion in such a disingenuous way. Is basically just kind of to paraphrase and summarize what's going on there. So it's in another sense, the Pharisees who have taken this commandment, we see in Exodus and Deuteronomy, this commandment of honoring the Sabbath and keeping it holy, and have over time, with the additions of laws in Leviticus, but then in their own interpretations and rabbinical traditions since then, have come to take that letter of the law so seriously and so intently that they've lost the spirit of what the Sabbath is intended to do. The Sabbath is about being able to provide rest and equity and justice to all of God's people in the community of Israel, from the slaves right on up to those who are in power. And so for the Pharisees, they had become so rigid in their application of it that it had become more like a policing mechanism by which they were oppressing people. And so that's all that to say, and I've gone on for a while now. It's just that this is why they come to Jesus and they're like, look, dude, like you can see in the image here, the piece of artwork, they're walking through the fields and the disciples are taking those heads of grain and they're rubbing them in their hands. So they're basically they're reaping and threshing, which, and they're not doing it with scythes and millstones and stuff like that. They're just using their hands. And so the Pharisees have become so rigid that in this moment they're saying even that rubbing their hands together to get those wheat seeds out to eat, they're breaking Sabbath law. And it's you can see why this kind of aggravates Jesus. They've completely lost the spirit of what the Sabbath is about. And Jesus will, in all of the Gospels, continue to break what would be considered right and wrong things to do on the Sabbath. He blurs those lines because Jesus is helping people to understand that the Sabbath, in Mark's Gospel, the Sabbath was made for humankind, not humankind for the Sabbath. So the Sabbath is meant to be a gift from God to the people of God, rather than a means by which the people are limited in their ability to be human beings, if that makes sense. It's not meant to be an oppressive rule. It's meant to be a liberating gift. And so every time we see Jesus doing something on the Sabbath, it's going to include feeding people, healing people, helping people to experience God's love for them. And so he is liberating them to experience the spirit of what the Sabbath is all about. And so in a way, Jesus is actually showing them what the Sabbath is truly about. It's not about limiting people's ability to be human beings, but rather it's about helping them to be fully human and to be liberated from that. If you have an ailment and you're unable to fully participate in the life of the community and worship, then you can't fully experience the Sabbath. You are oppressed or by your own, either by your own body's inability to do something, or by the way your community has ostracized you because you would be considered unclean. So all that's at work in this passage here. I'm going to shut up for a minute. What else? What else do you hear and see in this?
I think when I see the statement, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath, Jesus saying that, I try to imagine how he said that. Did he say that? Well, he always speaks with authority, but did he say that in a compassionate way? Did he say that? I mean, was he really upset? Did it come out that, what he was trying to make a point. But, I just always kind of think about, it doesn't say Jesus said it with compassion or with authority or just kind of stop to think about how he's perceived when he says that to the disciples. Yeah.
Really good observation, Cynthia. I wonder that too. The biblical writers, I guess, in the way that people wrote back then, weren't very expressive of to say Jesus exclaimed with with righteous indignancy or something, righteous anger. It would be peculiar to know if we could, it's like when somebody sends you an email or a text and you misread their tone.
Yeah,
you're not exactly sure. Yeah, it's very much like that. I would like to know that as well. Is he saying for the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath, or he's saying because the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath?
Definitely.
Yeah, and I think Jesus is exerting, so there's this whole thing here about this moment where David with the bread of the presence and stuff like that. This would be something that the Pharisees would have easily gone back to. This is in 1 Samuel 21, and it's a moment where David is he and Jonathan have just parted ways for a time, and he's on the run a little bit, David, and says David came to Nob where Ahimelech was priest. Ahimelech was shaking in fear when he met David. "Why are you alone? Why is no one with you?" he asked. David answered Ahimelech the priest, "The king has given me orders, but he instructed me, don't let anyone know about the mission I'm sending you on or about your orders. As for my troops, I told them to meet me at an undisclosed location. Now, what do you have here with you? Give me 5 loaves of bread or whatever you can find." "I don't have any regular bread on hand," the priest answered David, "just holy bread, but only if your troops have abstained from sexual activity." "Definitely," David answered the priest. "Whenever I go out to war, women are off limits. That's our standard, our operating procedure. Even on regular missions, the men's gear is kept holy. That's even more true today with the mission being holy along with the gear." So the priest gave David the holy bread because there was no other bread except the bread of the presence, which is removed from the Lord's presence and replaced by warm bread as soon as it is taken away. And so it's almost like a consecrated offering to God was set aside and then given to David and his troops in their great need. They had been kind of on doing something for Saul, and there were kind of in a tight spot, out of provisions, out of rations, and so in a moment of great need, that bread that was set aside as a holy offering to God was offered then to David and his troops. And so there's this sense that again, like what I was talking about, like on the Sabbath, when Jesus is kind of breaking the rules, so to speak, what he's doing is helping people in their great need to experience the freedom and the love and the provision and the rest and the justice of the Sabbath. So then on another instance, right, Jesus enters the synagogue to teach, and there's a man with a withered hand there. And you guys will note that here, the legal experts and the Pharisees, they're not just observing Jesus and his disciples walking through grain fields at a distance. They're in the temple too. And they say, "Oh, there's Jesus. Let's see what he does."
What can we accuse him of?
Right. Yeah. So you begin to see here the Pharisees and the scribes and the legal experts are all just kind of, so how can we get this guy?
Yeah.
He's really upsetting the norms of our religious traditions, and if he's not careful, he's going to start catching the eyes of the governmental authorities as well, and that's going to mean trouble for all of us. And so there's this delicate balance in the Gospels that's always been working with. There's the religious controversies. There's also the political controversies that Jesus might stir up, and this is why the Pharisees and legal experts are so keen to find some way to discredit him, so that they can maintain order, because they feel like if we just don't disturb anything, don't cause any riots or ruckus, even though we have Roman overlords, they'll let us kind of do what we want to do and keep our traditions. The moment we start being rabble rousers and stirring up people and doing things outside of the norms, that's when they're going to clamp down on us. And so there's that sense that that's going on as well. So, yeah. So what happens here? The legal experts, the Pharisees, they're like kind of leaning in to hear what Jesus has to say. What happens?
They're angry at him.
Yeah. Oops, sorry. Yeah. He heals this guy, and he doesn't just heal the guy. He pulls the guy out in front of them where they can clearly see what he's about to do. So it's forbidden to heal on the Sabbath. And so that we'll just say that it's forbidden to heal on the Sabbath. And so here Jesus does it, and he makes kind of a spectacle out of it. What are your thoughts on that? Why would Jesus pull this, make this a really public display in the synagogue?
It's like you said earlier, he's making a point that things should be done for the people, for God's people, and that, you should do good even if it's on the Sabbath.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's right on, David. Yeah, because he's saying, he gets this man to stand up in front of everybody, and then he asks them a question. He kind of he's anticipating what the Pharisees and legal experts are thinking. They're thinking, he's saying, they're about to try and nail me for doing this, but let me ask you an even bigger question. Like, your question here is down here in the minutia and the nuance of Sabbath law. I'm going to pull you back and ask you a 10,000 foot view question here, which is it legal on the Sabbath to do good or to do evil, to save life or to destroy it? And so again, we have this separation of the letter of the law and the spirit of the law. The letter of the law says it's unlawful to heal on the Sabbath. Jesus is asking the deeper moral, sacred question of, well, if there is opportunity, do you do good or do harm on the Sabbath? Because to not heal this man, to not liberate him from his ailment, to give him an opportunity to experience life to the fullest, that would be doing harm. That would not be doing good, to ignore his need, even on the Sabbath. And so he's asking the bigger question of, is it legal to do good or evil, to save life or to destroy it? And nobody has an answer to that. Often when Jesus asks the big 10,000 foot view questions, nobody has an answer for him, because they know the answer. And they don't want to admit that the answer that is exactly okay for Jesus to do what he's doing. And so he does this, and he makes the man healthy. And I don't know if you catch it. Like, what happens? Jesus heals the man, and then what?
They leave.
Yeah, they're ticked off, right? They're mad about it. They don't verbally respond to Jesus, but they're mad about it. They're like upset. They resent him for making this man well. And it's almost like Luke is telling us here that miracles don't necessarily lead to belief. That you can see a miracle with your own eyes in someone's life. They're being brought into close proximity to the living God, and yet still you can still be far from belief.
Yeah.
What
It's
is that?
interesting.
Yeah, go
It's
ahead.
interesting that they don't argue with him.
Mhm.
You know, I mean, they're mad. They begin to talk to each other, but they don't argue with Jesus. They just walk away.
Yeah, they just walk away furious. It's furious, and begin to talk about what to do with Jesus. It's amazing how stubborn and hard of heart like we can be. It's almost like we can witness something, a miracle, a profound blessing happen in someone's life. And instead of feeling joy and gratefulness for that person, sometimes we can feel resentment, even jealousy. Like, this just happened for this person in such a profound way. That didn't happen for me. You know, it's almost like this person gets off the hook and gets an easy way forward in life. And yet I'm still stuck where I've always been. That's kind of a lesser version of what happens here, but I feel like that's a way that we can relate to it. We can resent someone else, the good things, the miraculous things, the God things that happen in someone else's life simply because it has not happened in ours. So Jesus moves on, and Jesus comes to a place where he is going to, he's already called Peter, James, and John and the others to follow him. But now he's going to name them as his inner circle, if you will. Excuse me. So if somebody would just read these little verses, quick little snippet right here about them.
Okay, I will.
Go for it, Cynthia.
During that time, Jesus went out to the mountain to pray, and he prayed to God all night long. At daybreak, he called together his disciples. He chose 12 of them, whom he called apostles. Simon, whom
I'm
he
so
named-
sorry.
That's okay. Where am I? Simon, whom he named Peter, his brother Andrew, James, John, Philip, Bartholomew, Matthew, Thomas, James the son of Alphaeus, Simon, who was called a zealot, Judas the son of James, and Judas Iscariot, who became a traitor.
What are some things that you guys notice right off the bat about this passage?
I think you think about the 12 tribes.
That's a great observation, David.
Yeah. Also, he probably had more followers than this, and he was picking out 12 special people, probably to be leaders after he's gone.
That's actually a great observation. Jesus does, and Luke is very clear about those circles of disciples, right? He has kind of his BFFs, which would be like Peter, James, and John, and sometimes Andrew, but mostly just Peter, James, and John. Then he has the 12, which would be this group of disciples. Then he has a group of about 70 to 72 that follow him. And then you have like the crowds and the others that are always on the outskirts of what Jesus is doing, following, listening, but not necessarily being his disciples. And boatloads of women that followed him as well. And Luke is very explicit about that it was not these 12, it was the women who funded and made possible all the ministry that he does. That's in chapter 8. We'll get to that hopefully together this month. Anybody catch what Jesus does that's so important before he calls these 12?
He went out to pray.
Praise.
Yeah.
Pray.
Goes to pray.
And he doesn't just throw up a prayer to God about, oh God, help me. Yeah. All night long.
Right.
And I think this is the only place in the Gospels where it says explicitly Jesus prayed all night long. And that tells us a lot about how critical, how important this decision for Jesus was about who these closest disciples, this inner circle of disciples, should be. it's not something that Jesus does lightly, rather, but something that he does with great intention. Like we said, back when with Pastor Ross last month, you talked about Jesus calling Peter, Andrew, James, and John from the boats, right? And he called them to follow him, and they called and they followed him, and they left everything. But even still, they weren't, part of that inner circle of the 12 until this moment, right? And so there had been some time that Jesus was walking with them and the others, that he was thinking and discerning, what about them are these the ones who can carry this message and this life into the world, right? And there are others that he's called, like Levi, like we talked about last week, who are not in this list of disciples, who clearly followed Jesus, but maybe was not part of this inner circle of 12. What do you guys know about this group of disciples? Anything?
Matthew was a tax collector, wasn't he?
Yes, and so in Matthew's gospel, Matthew is the tax collector that Jesus calls, and not Levi, which is interesting to note. Mm-hmm.
We all know about Judas.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, we all know about Judas. Yes, we do. Yep.
Thomas.
Mm-hmm.
Doubting Thomas.
Thomas. I mean, we associate it with that.
Yeah, unless I see the hands and the nail marks in his hands and the gash in his side, I will not believe, right? What else? You think of anyone else? It's interesting because the lists of the disciples are slightly different in every gospel.
Mm-hmm.
The list of the 12. John never really gives a full list of the 12. He just assumes that when you read the 12 in John's gospel, that you just kind of know who that is. There are some players in John's gospel that we don't see in the others, like Nathaniel. Philip takes a more dominant role in things that he says and does in John's gospel. In Mark's gospel and in Matthew's gospel, I think those are the same list. But you don't have two Judases, right? It's Thaddeus is the other disciple that's listed in there. That's not listed in here. So peculiar that Jesus calls such a. Go ahead.
He does list Peter first and Judas Iscariot last. Sort of puts him in maybe what he considers a priority order.
That's actually an important point and observation there, John. Yeah, it's it's such an interesting mix of folks that Jesus calls together. We don't know a lot about all of them, but we know that Simon and Andrew, or Peter and Andrew and James and John, were fishermen, right? So they were guys who had likely aspired to some kind of religious, rabbinical tutelage and didn't make the cut. And so they were doing their family's trade. They were fishermen like their fathers before them, right? And Jesus comes along and sees these rejects on their boats with their dads and says, "Hey, come follow me." Jesus chooses them. Not educated guys, but they become the very leaders that God needs for the church, right? Philip, we hear a lot more about in John's gospel, a lot more vocal disciple. He's the one who goes out and starts talking about Jesus. This is the guy that we've been hoping for, the Messiah, right? Andrew and Philip both do that in John's gospel. Bartholomew, don't know much about him. Matthew, we believe, was probably a tax collector of some kind. Thomas has a nickname. He's called the Twin. Don't know if that's because he and Jesus resembled each other in some way, but Thomas is a very important figure in John's gospel as well. He asks a boatload of questions throughout the gospel of Jesus. James, the son of Alphaeus, perhaps he was of a wealthy upbringing. Why else would you name someone's father unless that name carried some kind of significance, right? Simon, who was called a zealot. Simon was part of a group of people called the Zealots who were very eager for a messianic figure to appear who would be like a warlord and drive out the Romans from Judea and liberate the people of Israel so that a king could ascend the throne again. So you have these like militant, you even have like a militant among Jesus's closest disciples. Judas, the son of James, don't know much about him. And then Judas Iscariot, of course, the son of Simon, who became a traitor. Jesus calls all these kinds of people to himself and says, yeah, I've called you, I've chosen you to be the bearers of God's reign in the world. Kind of gives me hope. If Jesus could call a bunch of misfits and rejects like these guys to be the very ones who by the Spirit form the community that becomes the church, then maybe there's hope for the rest of us as well.
Yeah.
Any other thoughts on the disciples real quick, or we can kind of keep moving on here? I'm gonna hit play again on this because so it get a little bigger. This one's a doozy of a read. The text is very small. I'll read this one. But so Jesus moves along. He calls the 12, and then he moves into what in Luke's gospel we call the Sermon on the Plain, which is the parallel to Matthew's Sermon on the Mount. It's much shorter than Matthew's version, but it encompasses many of the same things as well as some very distinct differences. So listen closely. Jesus came down from the mountain with them and stood on a large area of level ground. A great company of his disciples and a huge crowd of people from all around Judea and Jerusalem and the area around Tyre and Sidon joined him there. They came to hear him and to be healed from their diseases, and those bothered by unclean spirits were healed. The whole crowd wanted to touch him because power was going out from him and he was healing everyone. Jesus raised his eyes to the disciples and said, "Happy are you who are poor, because God's kingdom is yours. Happy are you who hunger now, because you will be satisfied. Happy are you who weep now, because you will laugh. Happy are you when people hate you, reject you, insult you, and condemn your name as evil because of the human one, or the Son of Man. Rejoice when that happens. Leap for joy because you have great reward in heaven. Their ancestors did the same things to the prophets. But how terrible for you who are rich, because you have already received your comfort. How terrible for you who have plenty now, because you will be hungry. How terrible for you who laugh now, because you will mourn and weep. How terrible for you when all speak well of you. Their ancestors did the same things to the false prophets." Let's just take that first paragraph before we get to the blessings and woes, just about Jesus coming down from the mountain. What are some things that you notice about Jesus's movement, where he is, where everyone else is?
It's kind of like Moses coming down from the mountain.
A great observation, Jillian. I appreciate that. Yeah. There's always these. There's always going to be these things that are pointing back to those who preceded Jesus in the history of Israel: Moses, Elijah, people like that. In Matthew's gospel, the sermon takes place atop the mount, the hill, in the same way that that Moses ascended the mountain and there received God's word in the form of the law, the Decalogue, the 10 Commandments. Right here in Luke's gospel, Luke reports that Jesus came down from the mountain and there spoke to the people. And Moses also came down from the mountain, his face glowing. And what did Moses find when he got to the bottom of the mountain? Right, that the people had hastily created an idol for themselves and were worshiping that in an image, a false image of God. And so in a way, Jesus is coming down from the mountain and addressing those closest to him to keep them from falling into those same holes of idolatry and doom. It's a great observation. What else do you hear and see in this?
Well, the crowd recognized he was a great healer, and that's why they wanted to touch him. and to be with them.
It seems to be a lot of like, there always seems to be like mixed reasons why people show up to hear Jesus. Yeah, but a lot of them, like they probably at this point had heard something about, well, he's healed some people. Wonder if he could do that for me. They might have heard about the friends who lowered the paralytic into the house. They might have heard what Jesus did in the synagogue to the man with the withered hand. And here they are showing up to have their diseases healed, to have unclean spirits cast out of them. I always get hung up on this thing that Luke it makes explicitly clear. He came down from the mountain with them and stood on a large area of level ground. Everybody's on the same level here. Jesus speaks to them among them on level ground. That just speaks to me. It makes my heart sing a little bit that Jesus in a way is a great equalizer for all.
I never noticed that.
Okay.
You notice where the people are coming from?
Everywhere.
Everywhere. That's right. Everywhere. Yeah, Jews and Gentiles, right? Tyre and Sidon were kind of Hellenized regions, towns, Greek influenced regions around. They would have been in, I think, Lebanon today, or very northern reaches of Israel. I may be a little off on my geography, but they're coastal towns on the Mediterranean, but they would have had heavy Greek influence there. So likely a lot of Gentiles were gathering around Jesus too, which is just something that Luke will continue to point out, that though Jesus comes first to the people of Israel, there's always Gentiles on the periphery hearing and listening to Jesus and believing in him as well.
It's interesting to me that the artwork does not depict what we read in the scripture, in the sense that Jesus is sitting up on a rock.
Yeah. Yeah. And it may just be like a sense of, he's got to be somewhere where he can give him a little bit of a vantage so he can hear him. But yeah, it's true. Yeah, there is a sense that they're on kind of a rocky terrain there, right by the Sea of Galilee. This is the Common English Bible. So instead of saying blessed are you who are poor, it says happy. And that just kind of gets the sense. When we think about the word beatitudes, it just means a state of being that causes one to be happy or blessed. So they're equal translations, but it's just not one where, that's why I chose it, because it's not, we're used to saying the blessed are's, but here is a happy are you. So Luke's a little bit different than Matthew's, isn't it? What do you see as far as differences between what you're used to hearing, what we read more often in Matthew's gospel?
Well, the Sermon on the Mount than the level plain. Because, you think about a Sermon on the Mount, you think about people all different levels, hearing and listening to him, and he's at the top.
Right. Yeah. What about the
bottom?
yeah, that's right. Yeah, I always think about that scene from Life of Brian, where they're if you've seen that Monty Python's Life of Brian, where they're standing at a distance, and and Jesus starts, he's saying, "Blessed are the peacemakers," and he's like, "What did he say? Blessed are the cheesemakers," like this constant mishearing of what Jesus is saying. But yeah, there's people that have come from really geographical distances of at least 100 miles to see Jesus here. And but yeah, there's a difference, right? In Matthew's gospel, Jesus is just giving a list of beatitudes. Blessed are you who this. What is a big difference you notice here in what Luke has on the lips of Jesus?
Luke talks about things, terrible things for the people who are rich or comfortable, and have plenty to eat now.
Yeah, not just blessings, but there's a list of blessings and a list of woes,
right.
To use an older translation. Yeah. That in Luke's gospel, we haven't really heard Jesus teach yet. We've seen Jesus call people. We've seen Jesus heal people. we've heard Jesus preach, we have not gotten a grasp for what are the teachings of Jesus that are of the kingdom of God. And here we start to get a sense of that. So we have 4 blessings and 4 woes, and each of them is a parallel to the other. And whereas Matthew leaves a little bit of generalization and interpretation there, even a way that we might spiritualize some of those things, like blessed are the meek, blessed are the merciful. These are just ways that we should be acting. Luke is very clear that Jesus is saying, blessed are the poor. He's literally meaning the poor, not just those who are poor in spirit, but the poor. Blessed are you who are poor, because God's kingdom is yours. But how terrible for you who are rich, because you have already received your comfort. How does that sit with you?
Well, it seems like it goes against the old Deuteronomic philosophy that if you were rich on earth, it was because you were good and being blessed by God.
Mm-hmm. And Deuteronomy later will say, be open-handed with the poor. All the Levitical laws of gleaning and of taking what is left over and what is extra and giving freely to the poor. Woe to you if you have plenty and your neighbor goes hungry, kind of things. Deuteronomy 15, kind of the year of Jubilee and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Isn't there a place in the Bible, I think in the Gospels, where they say, for whom much is given, much is expected? And
yes, that's right, Nancy. I'm trying to, let me think about, I'm gonna look it up so I don't have to sit here and think about it, because it might take me a minute to think about where that is. Luke 12. We're going to get there eventually, actually. So yeah, I thought it might be in Luke, but it's in Luke 12. Mm-hmm. Yeah, to whom much is given, much will be required. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. What other reactions and feelings did Jesus's blessings and woes stir up in you?
Well, it always gives you hope. If you're poor or if you're hungry now, you have hope for the future.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And if you weep now, you will, I like the happy are you who weep now, because you will laugh.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And that's such a great contrast. It's not like the kind of normal biblical language of like joy.
Right.
Those who mourn will reap joy, or something like in the Psalms. It's like you're going to laugh.
Yeah.
You're going to laugh. You who weep now will laugh. That.
A little concerning that he talks about trouble for you who laugh now. I mean, I sort of thought laughing now. I'm not sure what
Mm-hmm.
they mean by laughing, but seems like we should be joyful now.
Right. Yeah. And I don't know if you mean it in the sense of those who are laughing because you just think you're too hot to try, like you got it all and you got it made in the shade and you're laughing because, of all you have in spite of those who don't, like there's like a sense of perhaps that what Jesus is announcing here is a kind of great reversal. Those of you who seem abandoned at the margins, those of you who have been impoverished by the systems of this world, it's not always going to be that way. Something new is coming. A new age has dawned in which God, through Jesus Christ, is enacting a great reversal and reconciliation of everything. Right? That there's a sense that when people hate you, reject you, insult you, condemn you because of Jesus, there's a sense that some people cry persecution in the United States. We really don't have religious persecution here. There's really no such thing as that in the United States. I mean, but there are places around the world where it's very, very dangerous to be a Christian, right? There are places around the world where to announce yourself as such would mark you as a second-class citizen, or even wind you up in prison or jail. There's an interesting underground Christian movement in places even like North Korea, and so there's Imagine, always imagine that when you hear people cry persecution, imagine like, what does that really mean? What does that really mean? Rejoice when that happens. Leap for joy. It sounds like Paul. That reminds me of Paul. Like when people hate you, reject you, and socially condemn you because of Jesus. Rejoice when that happens. And that, like at Philippians 4, rejoice always. Again, I say rejoice. He's saying that from a cold, dank prison cell while he's sick. You know, that's profound faith. Right? But how terrible, you have to be careful about people speaking well of you because they said that of the false prophets. All right, John, we'll catch you later, Matt. Thank you for tuning in. Yeah. But how terrible when people speak well of you. You know, I think this goes to show how flippant we can be as people. Like, you know, we depend a lot on our reputation. We stake a lot on our reputation. What do people say about me? Do they say good things? Do they say bad things? And we put a lot of our self-worth into what people say of us. And I think that to a degree, that's okay. You kind of, what people know of you will either lead them to make an assessment of you as either being a good person or a bad person. But there's also an unhealthy way in which we can put a lot of stock into what other people say about us. And we can revel in that. And just because you're being praised by people doesn't mean that you are necessarily doing the right things or are a good person. There are a lot of evil people who got a lot of praise and just soaked all that praise and glory and reputation that they had. And they put a lot of their identity into that. Politicians are notorious for that, right? You know, just because people speak well of you, well, guess what? They spoke really well of a lot of false prophets too that took us down a dark path. You know, just remember that the office of prophet is not a desirable position. John the Baptist was beheaded. Jeremiah was cast out from the court and made to live out of a cave. You know, being a prophet is not something that someone seeks. Being a witness to the gospel is not always a desirable vocation, and yet it's the one that we're all called to be about, right? I want to share something from you in the commentary that I thought was just great. And it kind of helped to summarize some of these blessings and woes. It says, as throughout Luke's entire book, what is presented here is a hard-hitting gospel. It is good news to the poor and the powerless. It is also good news to the rich and the mighty, but only if they follow a path of radical obedience, which in turn will affect their riches and their power. I like the way that's worded. Because remember, we talked last week about Jesus calling Levi. He's calling kind of a wicked guy who was in cahoots with Rome and with the powers that be. And he would have been a person of high class and even perhaps nobility in the community, even though he was hated. He was a high status kind of person. And yet Jesus called and had mercy on him and said, I need someone just like you to follow me. And went and ate at his house with him. Even though Luke is really helping us to see Jesus's particular concern for the liberation of the poor and the powerless, the gospel is also, can be and is good news to the rich and the mighty, but only if they, like the poor and powerless, recognize their deep, visceral need for God and follow God in a path of radical obedience. Because if we're doing that, if we're following Jesus correctly, it's going to reorder our priorities. It's going to reshape how we understand things like wealth and status and resources. It's going to affect all of those things. If we're following Jesus, it has something to say. It has a way of affecting everything, every part of us. There's no part of us that God does not want to influence and to bestow grace upon grace to. Any other thoughts or comments or grievances with Jesus's words here?
One thing, like that middle section, where he talks about how we can be happy and content when everything around us is going bonkers.
Oh, that sounds like now, doesn't it?
It does.
Yes.
And it also sounds like Paul when he was assaulted in so many ways, and yet there was some sort stability and happiness about him, regardless of everything.
It's really nuts. I mean, you think about, like, man, to have lived a life, to have lived Paul's life, I just don't know if I could have done it, you know, and found a way in the midst of that to be who he was. He suffered, he hurt, he got sick of it. He was mad. He was sad. He was grieved to death by so many people that he associated with. And yet still, he never stopped conveying the message of Christ in his body, in his words. Somehow it took precedence over everything, or maybe because of its place in his life, its priority in his life, it shaped and colored everything else.
Thank goodness we aren't all called to be Paul.
Right.
Yeah. Count your lucky stripes, right? How that phrase goes. Yeah. So we're coming up on an hour. We can keep going if you want for a little while longer and do this next section, or we can save it for next week. I'm willing to do whatever is most comfortable for y'all. So.
Yeah.
I'm done.
I'm fine to keep going. Okay, we'll do this next section, and then we'll call it for today, and that'll be it. So okay, so here we are, Sermon on the Plain, Part 2. If somebody would be willing to read this section here.
I'll read.
Go for it.
But I say to you who are willing to hear, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who mistreat you. If someone slaps you on the cheek, offer the other one as well. If someone takes your coat, don't withhold your shirt either. Give to everyone who asks, and don't demand your things back from those who take them. Treat people in the same way that you want them to treat you. If you love those who love you, why should you be commended? Even sinners love those who love them. If you do good to those who do good to you, why should you be commended? Even sinners do that. If you lend to those from whom you expect repayment, why should you be commended? Even sinners lend to sinners, expecting to be paid back in full. Instead, love your enemies, do good, and pay them back in full. Instead, love your enemies, do good, and lend, expecting nothing in return. If you do, you will have a great reward. You will be acting the way children of the Most High. I run out of space there.
I'm sorry. You'll be acting in the way the children of the Most High act, for His kind and to ungrateful and wicked people. Yeah. Be compassionate, just as your Father is compassionate. Sorry about that. Yeah, so this image actually gives us more of a Sermon on the Plain feel, right? You got the 12 seated in front of Jesus, and then everybody else kind of at the bottom there, a little further away. This runs very parallel to Matthew's section on this in Matthew 5. But yeah, what do you hear in this passage, this little section?
I think it goes against human nature. Because, you know, the human nature is, what's that old, I guess some old saying I heard somewhere, like, fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me.
Right.
It's like you're kind of taught if someone cheats you, you don't have anything more to do with them, not that you love them or pray for them.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, and it seems, in Matthew's gospel, he's going to recall some of the Levitical law. You've heard it said, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, but I tell you, it's things like that. Or you've heard it said, but I say to you. Luke's audience as a gospel, and you might have already mentioned this, is likely more of a Gentile audience than a Jewish audience. And so Luke doesn't spend much time recalling some of those Old Testament Levitical laws like Matthew does. Matthew's always quoting it, and showing Jesus's connection to that as the one who fulfills the law. Luke doesn't do that kind of, you've heard it said, but I say to you. It just has Jesus preaching straightforward. You who are willing to hear, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you. You kind of got the golden rule here in this first paragraph. It's kind of the guiding ethic. But also don't just reduce this to the golden rule, because the ethic for our lives is Jesus. What does Jesus do? What does Jesus say? It's not just doing unto others as you've had them do unto you. There are ways in which that is lived out, specific concrete ways, like loving your enemies. And that's hard, right? I mean, loving your enemies, that might could be argued as the most radical thing of Christian faith, is when we love our enemies. And loving your enemy isn't saying, it's not just a spoken word. Like, you never have any contact with this person. You talk crap about them, but you say you love them still. That's not loving your enemies. I mean, it's much more radical than that. I think about, what was that school shooting, the Amish community years and years ago, where they as a community forgave the shooter who killed, their own children and stuff. To offer that kind of forgiveness and desire for reconciliation with someone who has literally robbed life from you, taken from you, your own flesh and blood. That's not something that was just like they just flipped a light switch and said, oh, we have to forgive here, right? I'm sure there was, even in such a religiously disciplined community, there had to be a lot of soul searching and pain and anguish that went into that decision to say, no, we must love here. And in his book, The Cost of Discipleship, Dietrich Bonhoeffer offers that. He says, I'm kind of paraphrasing, I kind of got part of the quote memorized, but not all of it. It says, who is more deserving of my love than my enemy who lives in the world without love? If we think about what Jesus is saying here, it's easy to love those who love you back. I mean, you'd hope for that, right? You want to do that because you've received something from them that elicits that kind of a response. But what about your enemy who lives in the world without love? How much harder is it? I mean, it's incredibly hard to show love to them, but who is more needing of it? Who is more deserving of it than an enemy? That kind of wrecks me every time I think about that quote. Because I'm usually ready to just kind of write people off. That's just kind of like what you were talking about, David. That's just kind of what we're just programmed to do. If somebody wrongs you, if somebody is, perpetrates some wickedness against you, like, deuces, see you later. You're not part of my life anymore. There's no desire to seek reconciliation with such a person. But Jesus says to love your enemies. That doesn't mean we cozy up to them. That doesn't mean that they have to be a regular part of our lives, but it means that that even those who wrong us, we would not dare withhold the love of God from them. It's hard.
What is the difference between, I hear people all the time say, I will forgive them. I don't like what they did, but I will forgive them as a person. Is that really forgiving them?
I think so, Cynthia. I think I think I mentioned in my sermon last week that the kind of the word that from which we get forgiveness in the Bible, it literally means to release. And so the act is that I'm refusing to let this wrong done, exercise control over my life. By releasing that, that doesn't let that person off the hook. If I've done wrong, it doesn't let me off the hook. There has to be accountability and consequences for the wrongs that we perpetrate against one another. And it's not saying that it's okay that that thing happened. What it is saying is that I refuse to let this determine my relationship to God and to other people. I refuse to let this kind of attitude of resentment and hatred become that which governs my thoughts and actions towards the person. Because I tell you what, like there, I mean, you know, I think about when my parents divorced, like my mom had an incredibly hard time forgiving my dad for infidelity, because for my mom for a long time, I think she felt like forgiveness meant saying that what happened was okay.
Oh, okay.
And I don't, and forgiveness is not saying that what somebody did was okay. It's saying that you refuse to let that be, you refuse to let that thing replace God's love and God's salvation through Jesus Christ to be that which guides your thoughts and actions towards other people. Like this, the sense here of like what the golden rule is: treat people the same way you want them to treat you. It's not just like do as you would want done. It's more like do as God would do. Do as God would do. That's the whole ethic here of following Jesus. Is, and Wesley would say that you may have heard of this notion of Christian perfection. That doesn't mean that we're sinless and never do anything wrong or never do anything outside of God's love. It means that over time, little by little, step by step, inch by inch, God's love and grace becomes the center point of our lives, such that all of our thoughts and actions and words are governed by that love. To be made perfect in this life would mean a sense that God's love forever and always is that which guides the thoughts and actions that you have towards others. So in a way, it's you are becoming a person who does as God does.
Okay.
Because the next paragraph, Jesus says, look, if you love those who love you, there's no reward in that. Like even sinners do that. Like even the worst among us love those who love them back. There's no real like effort. You know, there is some effort, but it's not a kind of radical effort that moves beyond what is like what you said, David, is the kind of default way that humans operate, right? If I love my brother, well, then I'd expect him to love me back. And I do things for my brother and we take care of each other. And so of course I'd expect him to love me back, or I want to love him back because he does those things for me. He's, you know, his relationship's an important part of my life. You know, if you do good to those who do good to you, where's the reward in that? Everybody does that. You know, if somebody does you a favor or shows up to your house with a casserole, of course that makes you want to return the favor for them, right? Because they showed care and love for you. They did something good for you. You know, if you lend to somebody who can pay you back, well, you know, it's easy to lend to somebody when you have that assurance that you're going to get what you give back. It's harder to make a radical gesture of giving, knowing that nothing's coming back to you. That person very likely may not be able ever to pay you back for something you do for them, right? So there's a sense of there's a kind of greater righteousness that Jesus is calling us to. The way that God works is a way of mercy and of never asking if another person is worthy of receiving what God calls us to give.
Yeah.
Any other thoughts on that? Saint Isaac the Syrian in the 7th century said, didn't the Lord share his table with tax collectors and sinners? So then do not distinguish between the worthy and unworthy. All must be equal for you to love and to serve.
Wow.
And that is that's another thing that kind of sticks with me. All must be worthy for you to, don't distinguish between worthy and unworthy. All must be worthy for you to love and to serve. So perhaps we'll leave it there for today. And next week we'll pick back up with the next little section, which is talking about judgment It's Luke's version of "Don't judge, so you won't be judged," and then we'll talk about the blind leading the blind, and a bad tree can't produce good fruit, and those wonderful things. And we'll wrap up the Sermon on the Plain and move on to chapter 7. So, any final thoughts? How about we do this? As a way to close today, let's go around and everybody has a chance to just say a takeaway that from today. It can be a phrase, can be one sentence, but nothing more than that. What's your takeaway for today?
I think it makes me think about not being selfish with what I have. Because there's so much a tendency on our part not to even put ourselves out there where somebody could take our cloak so that we give them our shirt.
That's a good word.
Back when the scripture that's talking about Jesus calling his disciples, it helps me know that Jesus is always calling us, and that we need to be attentive to his teachings as the disciples were, and for Jesus to show us, which direction we need to go, and things that we need to think, and things we need to pray about, and things that we need to believe, and be strong in that belief. So.
I feel like even though I can be unworthy sometimes, God still loves me, and he calls all of us, even though all of us can be that way.
Yeah.
I've been sitting here thinking about all that we've gone through this past year. And there's so many people involved that it's hard to love them. They have done things that's not right. And I was thinking as we were talking about this, it's really hard right now.
It is really hard. And I appreciate you just naming that and just leaving it at that. It's really hard. Because that's real. I mean, yeah, it's just really hard right now to love everybody.
Yeah.
Amen.
Jesus had a way of shining light into all the corners of anybody's life he talked with. He showed us, illuminated God's will and how we should live our lives in a real way. I often think of Jesus when he healed or whatever, he told maybe 2 people to go and sin no more. He didn't make that demand of everybody.
Right.
I think that's a reality that we have to face. He didn't call us to be Paul. He didn't call us to be the Virgin Mary or whatever, He called us to be us and to do what he wants us to do within our lives. And it's just, that in itself is gives us a sense of freedom, I think.
Yes.
I just think it continues, Patrick, to show what God is asking of us daily. One day we think, oh, I've got this all together, but he's constantly is putting things in front of us, and to be more purposeful or intentional in our daily walk.
Yeah,
and
I love
that we can't do it all. We can't do it. Like you're saying, we can't love all these people. It's a work in process.
I think it's an important distinction. I mean, because when God calls us, it's not just like a one-time ditty, right? It's like every day. It's every day. Like Jesus says later in Luke's gospel, those of you who want to come after me must take up your cross daily and follow me. That's an important word there in Luke's gospel, daily, right? Yeah, it's important. I'm going to pray for us. I think my takeaway for today is it's just remarkable the people that Jesus draws together. I mean, how very different they are, and how very different the philosophies and their ways that they think about things are. And just in that list of disciples. And I think the church is its best when it's pulling that together, and all of us are being transformed at the same time. Yeah. I'm going to offer a prayer for us as we depart today. So, gracious God, we thank you for this time, for the love and insights shared by all of us that are here. We're grateful for that you have called us and we have listened to you in creating this space in our lives to study your word. May this word continue to illumine our hearts and lives in the days ahead, so that when we gather again, we would come refreshed, excited, and ever so eager to dive into your word together. I pray that you would bless us in the intervening days with health and goodness, and that we would be attentive to the ways that you are every day calling us to follow you. Amen.
Amen.
See you guys next time. Take care.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye, y'all.